The Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by BASF.
Hi, I'm Amber Bell, and this is Real Agriculture. I am standing here today with Sean Prager, who is a professor of plant sciences at the University of Saskatchewan. And we're going to do a pulse school today. We're going to be talking about pea aphids, specifically in lentils, but I think that some of this information will cross over to other pulses. So welcome, Sean. It's fantastic to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you. Happy to be here.
Okay, so pea aphids in lentils. Do you want to kind of go in depth, like just give us some background on how they might impact lentils?
Sure. So pea aphids, like most aphids, have two life stages. They can be sexually reproducing. We don't typically care about in pea aphids and crops. And then they can be parthenogenic. So parthenogenic means they are females and they're only females, and then they give live birth essentially to more females that are already pregnant when they give birth. So if you think of Russian nesting dolls, that's the analogy we usually use. That's what it's like. So you just keep getting more and more and more aphids, and because of that, their population sizes can grow very quickly because they don't have to have eggs and they don't have to develop very long before they can already reproduce.
Right, and that kind of brings us into the thresholds. And you were talking about how the thresholds they change depending on how many days until you're going to spray, and it changes quite drastically, right?
That's right. Because the time from when you sample till when you actually take action is time in which these insects can increase their population size. And because their population size can increase quite rapidly, depending on the conditions, you need to adjust the threshold you use to when you're going to take action. So if you're going to spray tomorrow, you can let the aphid population be larger than if you are, before you make a decision, than if you're going to spray a week from now. Because in the time between when you've counted and when you would spray, that's 6 or 7 days, that's 6 or 7 days that the population is going to increase. And so a lot of the economic thresholds, certainly the ones for lentils that are now available, account for that time between when you make a decision and when you can actually take action.
Right, and the thresholds are different depending on the region that you're in, correct?
That's right, because of the thresholds need to account for the market value of what you're growing, and then also because of the insects' growth rates, which varies in different regions, and because the varieties are grown are different. All of that affects the rate at which the insects increase in population size, and they also affect the value of the actual crop you're growing. And so those two factors go into the thresholds, and so because they don't remain the same in different places, you need thresholds that are sort of specific to where you are.
Okay, so talking about economic thresholds, I mean, realistically, what it comes down to is what producers are experiencing in the field. So what environmental conditions are a hazard when producers should get out there and start scouting because it's a risk? So
there's several. So the lesser one, but that's worth considering, is precipitation. So generally speaking, we think aphids will like happier plants, that is, ones that are healthier, so more rain. So if you get rain, you're probably going to have more aphid problems than if you have a dry year. In fact, one of the ways we often talk about it and tell people think about it is that wet years mean aphids and disease, dry years mean grasshoppers.
Right.
Now, the other one, and probably the more important one, is temperature. So the warmer the temperature is, up to a point, the more quickly the aphids will reproduce, and so the more aphids you'll get and the more generations you'll get in a given period of time. There's a cap to that. The cap seems to be around 30 degrees. So when you get somewhere between 30 and 35, it's too hot for them and then they will start dying. But when you're below that, say, 30 mark, when you're in the sort of the high 20s, you'll actually get is a very, very fast reproduction. So if you're seeing aphids and it's very warm, you can assume that the populations are going to increase very rapidly. If you see them and it's cool, 15, 20 degrees, you probably have a lot longer before you have to worry because they're just not going to reproduce at the same rate.
Right, and they travel a fair bit. We were talking about rotation and, so can you speak to some of that, how they travel and why, what some of the factors are in deciding on management? Yeah,
so aphids are funny because in addition to being sexual and non-sexual forms, they also have winged and unwinged forms. So the wingless forms we don't typically expect to move very much because they don't have wings. But what happens is then they get wings, and when they get wings, they can fly.
Right.
And that flight, for us, unfortunately, here in Western Canada, means two things. It means they can either fly from places in the United States up into Canada. It can also mean that they can fly from one crop to another. So here that can mean flying off of things like alfalfa or red clover where they might be overwintering, that might be where the eggs are, or where they just might be reproducing, so they can fly off of those things into your crops and you start getting crops. But it also means that they will move from crop to crop. And what we often expect to happen is that they will start on peas, and then they will move into lentils, and then eventually into fava.
So if you see them in your pea field, you know, and you have lentils nearby,
you should be looking in your lentils. Exactly, yes,
right.
Because we would expect that, especially if you have large numbers in your peas, as the peas start to senesce, they're going to move into the lentils. Okay. Right. So what they're really following, and anyone that grows these things knows that, right? They're basically following what your harvest schedule would be, right? As they mature, they're moving from the very early maturing pulses into the later maturing pulses because they're greener and happier.
So how exactly do aphids damage plants? What does that damage look like, Sean?
There are 3 different ways, 4 maybe, that we expect aphids to damage plants, or at least to lentils. The most important, at least right now, is direct feeding. So the aphids feed on the plant and they take the sap away that lowers the nutrients, and that can cause all sorts of things. It can cause premature senescence, so they'll senesce early. It can cause smaller pods, it can cause less pods, it can cause less podding, it can cause less seed, all kinds of things like that. It can cause wilting, and in extremely bad cases, it will actually cause plant death. The second is that when the aphids feed, they produce aphid waste. We call it honeydew. It's basically aphid poop. And because it's very sugary, it can lead to sooty molds on your plants. So if you have very high aphid numbers, you also get sooty molds. And sooty molds cause sort of the problems that sooty molds do, which includes reduced photosynthesis and things like that. The third problem of aphids is that aphids are vectors, and so they transmit viruses. In Western Canada, we don't typically think very much about viral pathogens in our crops. But in other parts of the world, especially other lentil growing parts of the world, and that includes both Australia and in the Middle East, more than half, sometimes the majority of the loss that you experience is actually from viruses. We have some of those viruses at least in Saskatchewan. We just don't know the extent to which we have them or the amount of damage they're doing.
Is there research happening on the viruses and how much of that's impacting producers and the bottom line? There is. It's early stages because it's just starting to become something that we're aware of.
And so we're still at the part where we're looking to see if they're there and developing the different testing methods to confirm what we have and to sort of identify what some of the symptoms look like and sort of those very basic pieces of information. But some of those are what you need in order to get further along and will help us get an idea of how much damage we really are getting from these viruses that are being transmitted by these aphids in the pulses. And we expect that they're going to get worse because as you get more aphids, you typically get more viruses that the aphids transmit. And
right.
We've been seeing worse aphid years every year for the last 3 or 4 years.
Well, and as you mentioned, with the way that they breed,
yeah,
it's it's not necessarily a problem that's going to just go away on its
That's
own.
right. And unfortunately, it also means that the tools we have changed because not all insecticides are effective in controlling a virus the same way as they are controlling the insects themselves. It's a different problem. And not all thresholds and injury limits, in fact, most are designed with viruses in mind. They're designed for this this direct feeding. And so what you can tolerate in terms of damage is very different when you're worrying about a plant getting sick and that being the problem versus when you're worried about the number of insects feeding on the plant.
Actual physical damage.
Yeah.
Okay. And are there any varieties, is there any breeding happening that helps with resistance to aphids?
In Western Canada, no. So there are resistant varieties to pea aphid in lentils. None of those are the varieties that we grow in Western Canada. None of those are the varieties that are adapted to Western Canada. The closest you would become is a couple of the American varieties. There's ongoing work to do that. My lab is doing a lot of that work, but we are years away from having any varieties that have those traits in them. And that applies to both lentil and to pea. We just don't have those traits yet in the varieties we have.
So what would you recommend to producers that are experiencing problems with pea aphids?
Well, the first thing I write is the standards. Is use your thresholds. So use the thresholds. They're available. They're on my website. They're in other places. Use the thresholds. Use those to make your decisions. Don't spray until you see those thresholds. The natural enemies do a good job in the pea aphids when there are not too many of them, and you don't want to harm those. And then the other thing is rotate your modes of action. There are different insecticides that you can use to control pea aphids, and there is at least potentially resistance to some of the more commonly used ones, and so you don't want to rely on those, A, because you don't want more resistance, and B, because they may not always work. So it is worth rotating your modes of action, particularly if you have really heavy pea aphid pressure and you're concerned about it. They are sometimes more expensive. Okay. But in fact, the thresholds that are available actually account for insecticide costs, so you can even adjust to the different insecticide costs. So it is worth it, and some of the more expensive insecticides that are available are also better on beneficials, so there's a benefit there where it might work. So it's not anything particularly unusual. It's really the same things we tell you all the time, and unfortunately, it's just that a lot of the other cultural controls and things that we might tell you to use aren't terribly effective given the sort of the acreage of pulse crops we grow here. Yeah.
And how much of a problem is resistance to insecticides?
We don't know, and therein is the problem. So this year in particular, there's been a lot of reports of people spraying, especially pyrethroid insecticides, and them not working. We're not sure if that actually is the case or not, but we're sort of doing those surveys right now, so we're trying to figure that out. Unfortunately, we're not sure we're going to have an answer in time for this season. Hopefully, we'll have a little bit more information for the future seasons, but it's known that pea aphids can get resistance to at least to pyrethroids. So it's a very valid concern, if not one that we know for sure is the case now.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us on Real Agriculture, and that was Sean Prager on this episode of Fall School.